The New Testament tells you the names of Jesus' brothers, 4 of them: James, Joses, Simon, and Judas. It tells you his mother's name. It tells you the name of his legal father. It tells you he had sisters, though it cannot be bothered to name them. The family record of the most important man in Christian history is specific enough to give you a list you can cite chapter and verse. But there is one name the record does not give you. There is one person who appears by name in every single gospel, a person who funded the entire ministry out of her own wealth, a person who stood beneath the cross while the apostles fled, a person who was the first witness of the resurrection in all 4 canonical accounts, a person whom Jesus himself, on the morning of the resurrection, personally commissioned to carry the news, and whose children, whose family, whose name after Jerusalem are simply not there. Not mentioned, not preserved, not permitted to survive. Her name was Mary Magdalene, and the silence around her life after the resurrection is not an accident. It is a decision. Something this complete, this precise, this comprehensive in its erasure of a woman, this central to the story, does not happen by itself. What I am going to show you today changes the picture you were given. I am going to show you 4 things. A manuscript that has been sitting in the British Library in London for over a century, written in an ancient language called Syriac, assembled by a scholar in the 6th century, and never once translated for you by the Church that could have done so at any moment. A medieval chronicle, written by an archbishop, that places Mary Magdalene in southern France. A document from the year 1521 that names the woman who was there when she arrived. And a pilgrimage that is happening right now, today, that has been happening every single year for 500 documented years, carried by a people who never stopped saying a name the Church never wanted spoken. At the end of all 4 of those things, there is a name. Her name was Sarah, and there is a document that names her. Let us begin with what the Gospels actually say, because before you can understand what was hidden, you have to understand what the official record left behind. According to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verse 3, the people of Nazareth identified Jesus by his family. They named his mother. They named his brothers James, Joses, Simon, and Judas. And they acknowledged his sisters, though they never named them. According to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verses 55 and 56, the same list is confirmed. 4 brothers, unnamed sisters. This is what the Church preserved carefully enough to record by name. Now look at what those same 4 Gospels tell you about Mary Magdalene. According to Luke, chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, she was one of the women who followed Jesus, and I want you to hear these exact words, ministered unto him of their substance. That is the King James translation. It means she used her own money to support the ministry. She was not a follower who watched from a safe distance. She was a patron. She was a financier. She was the person whose resources kept the movement alive while it moved from town to town. According to Matthew chapter 27, verse 56, she was present at the crucifixion. According to Mark chapter 15, verse 40, she was present at the crucifixion. According to John chapter 19, verse 25, she was present at the crucifixion. 3 independent gospel accounts. The same woman, the same location, standing at the cross when others had gone, and then the resurrection. According to Matthew chapter 28, verses 1 through 10, the first witness of the resurrection is Mary Magdalene. According to Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8, the first witness is Mary Magdalene. According to Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 10, the first witness is Mary Magdalene. According to John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18, the first witness is Mary Magdalene. All 4, every single gospel, not a male apostle, not any of the 12, her. But here is what John adds that the others do not. According to John chapter 20, verses 17 and 18, Jesus does not simply appear to her. He speaks to her. He gives her a commission. Go and tell the others. He chooses this one woman and no one else to carry the most important announcement in the history of the world. He makes her the messenger. The woman who funded the ministry becomes the woman he entrusts with its central revelation. And then the canonical record ends. No mention of where she went. No mention of what she built. No mention of a husband, of children, of a name that survived her. The woman who appears in more crucifixion and resurrection accounts than any other figure in the four Gospels simply vanishes. After resurrection morning, the Church has nothing more to say about her. Why? Why does the most important woman in the Gospel narrative leave no trace of a life after Jerusalem? Why is the woman Jesus personally commissioned to carry the news of the resurrection given no legacy in the official record? Why do we know the names of 4 of his brothers, but nothing, not a single detail about her family? Why do we know who his brothers were, but not who her children were? If you have ever read the resurrection account and felt that something was missing, that the silence around this woman is too clean, too total, too conveniently complete, that instinct is not confusion. That is perception. That is you reading the absence correctly. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. I am genuinely fascinated to know how many true seekers of truth like you have already felt this, that the story ends in the wrong place, that something was removed. Write your country, write your city. And if this is your first time hearing these questions asked out loud, if no one in the official account ever invited you to ask them, this channel is for you. There is a document, not a rumor, not a theory dressed up in ancient language, a real, physical, catalogued manuscript that has been sitting in the British Library in London for over a century, written in Syriac, one of the oldest Christian languages in the world, an Aramaic dialect used by the first Eastern Christian churches, assembled into its current form by a scholar in the 6th century. It has been there the whole time. There was never a moment it was lost. It was sitting in a library in one of the great cities of the Western world, catalogued and preserved, accessible to any scholar who knew where to look and what question to ask. And inside it, hidden inside what looks on the surface like nothing more than an ancient account of an Old Testament patriarch and the Egyptian woman he married, researchers have decoded something the Church never told you was in there. A record of the woman beside Jesus, a record of the children they had together. And at the end of a trail that runs from a library in London, through a medieval chronicle, through a document written in 1521 to a crypt on the southern coast of France, there is a name that has never stopped being spoken aloud, a name carried for 500 documented years by a people who have never stopped making the journey, never stopped coming to say it, never allowed it to disappear despite everything that was done to make them forget. Her name was Sarah, and by the time this video is finished, you will know everything the Church decided you should not. The British Library sits in the heart of London, a few blocks from the British Museum. It is the kind of institution where the weight of centuries presses down on you before you open a single page. It holds over 170 million items, books, maps, manuscripts, ancient documents from every corner of the known world. If a text was important enough to be copied and preserved, there is a reasonable chance some version of it is in that building. And for over a century, something was waiting in there that the Church never told you about. Not stolen, not buried, not locked away by some shadowy council of gatekeepers, catalogued, shelved, given a reference number, accessible to any scholar with the credentials to request it. A Syriac codex from the 6th century, sitting in one of the great research libraries of the Western world, and the institution that calls itself the guardian of Christian truth, never once mentioned it to the people kneeling in its pews. The text is called Joseph and Asenath. On the surface, it appears to be exactly what it claims to be: a narrative account of the Old Testament patriarch Joseph, the son of Jacob who was sold into slavery in Egypt, and Asenath, the Egyptian woman he married, as described in the book of Genesis. It tells the story of their courtship, their marriage, their life together, their children. The Syriac version of this text was translated from the Greek around the year 550 CE by a scholar named Moses of Ingala. That translation was then gathered into a larger historical chronicle, assembled around 570 CE by a compiler that scholars today call Pseudo-Zacharias Rhetor. 2 copies of this chronicle survive, one from the 6th century, one from the 12th. Both are housed in the British Library in London. Both have been there for over 100 years. Generation after generation of clergymen, bishops and theologians who could read Syriac walked through that library or knew it existed, and none of them brought this text to the congregation's attention. It sat in the archive while believers around the world were told that the complete story of Jesus had already been given to them, that nothing had been left out, that the record was whole. In November 2014, 2 researchers decided to say what the institution had not. Zimcha Jacobovici is an investigative journalist and filmmaker with a long record of pursuing historical questions that official bodies prefer to leave closed. Barry Wilson is a professor of religious studies at York University in Toronto, a specialist in early Christianity and the history of the Gospels. Together, they spent years studying the British Library's Syriac text. And in November 2014, they published a book called The Lost Gospel, decoding the ancient text that reveals Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, published by HarperCollins. Their method is called typological analysis. I want to be precise about something here, because critics of this book will tell you the method is invented and speculative. It is neither. Typological analysis is the standard interpretive framework that Syriac Christian scholars have used for centuries to read exactly this category of text. It is how the earliest Syriac theologians understood the relationship between the Old Testament and the New. In this tradition, figures from Genesis can represent New Testament realities. A patriarch from the Hebrew Scriptures can be a coded portrait of a figure from the Gospels. A story about Joseph and his Egyptian wife can carry within it a hidden account of someone else entirely. What Jacobovici and Wilson claim to have decoded using this method is the following. The Joseph in this text represents Jesus. The Asenath in this text represents Mary Magdalene. The courtship described in the text is their courtship. The marriage described is their marriage. The family the text documents is the family that Jesus and Mary Magdalene built together. And if they are right, then sitting in a British library for over 1,000 years, accessible to anyone who knew Syriac, was an account of Jesus' marriage and his children that the Church never once brought to light. But here is what the book's critics pointed to, and it is something I am not going to hide from you. The scholar who actually translated the Syriac text into English for this book, the professor whose linguistic work made the decoding project possible, was a man named Tony Burke, a professor at York University. And when The Lost Gospel was published, Tony Burke said something that the authors had not said. He said, and I am quoting him directly, Jesus and Mary are nowhere in the manuscript. Think about what that means. The man who converted this ancient Syriac text into English word by word, who spent his professional life studying documents exactly like this one, looked at the same manuscript Jacobovici and Wilson were calling the hidden story of Jesus' family, and said, I do not see them in there. Now here is the distinction that matters, because it is the distinction everything else in this video depends on. Tony Burke was the translator. His job was linguistic. He determined what the words say, literally, in the most direct reading of the Syriac. Jakubowicz and Wilson were the decoders. They took Burke's translation and applied the typological layer on top of it. They were not asking what the words say on the surface. They were asking what, in the long tradition of Syriac typological reading, those surface words are encoding underneath. Burke translated. Jakubowicz and Wilson decoded. That is the structure of the disagreement. Whether you accept that those are two genuinely different operations, and whether the decoding reveals a legitimate reading or projects one onto the text, is something this video will give you the evidence to decide for yourself. But here is what the text says, at the level that no one disputes. According to the biblical book of Genesis, chapter 41, verses 50 through 52, Joseph and his wife, Aseneth, have two sons. Not daughters. Sons. The firstborn is named Manasseh. The second is named Ephraim. These are the names in the Genesis narrative. These are the names the lost gospel decoding identifies as representing the children of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Two sons, named, documented, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now I want you to hold that carefully, because this is where the honest version of this investigation and the incomplete version of it part ways. A document that names two sons is not a document that has finished telling you about this family. A document that names sons is not a document that has named only sons. It is a document that preserved what it was permitted to preserve. And the question that the rest of this video is built to answer is simple. If the Syriac manuscript encodes two sons, and the trail that follows it leads to southern France and ends in a crypt where a name has been spoken aloud every year for 500 documented years, what is the name of the daughter that survived? There is a second tradition, one that does not begin in a library or end on a catalogue page, one that begins on a shoreline, one that follows a boat from Jerusalem to the coast of France, one that ends in a name spoken in a crypt in Provence, by the same community of people, year after year, for 5 centuries. We are living in days when manuscripts that sat in silence for 1400 years are finally being opened. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. Do not miss a single revelation. What comes next will answer the question this document left open. 2 sons were named. The daughter was not. But she was not forgotten. There is a second document. It was not found in a library. It was not catalogued and shelved by a curator who gave it a reference number. It was buried in the Egyptian desert, hidden inside a sealed clay jar left beneath the earth by someone who understood precisely what would happen to it if the wrong people found it. It stayed buried for over 1600 years. In December 1945, near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, that jar was found. A local farmer struck it with his mattock while digging for fertilizer at the base of a cliff. He broke it open. Inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, 13 books preserved for 16 centuries in the dry heat of the Egyptian desert, containing texts the institutional church had never wanted the world to read. One of those codices, the second volume of the Nag Hammadi collection, contained as its third text a document called the Gospel of Philip. It was composed in Syria in the late 2nd or 3rd century. The standard English translation was first published in 1962 and revised in 1996. And inside it, in a passage the church had no knowledge of until that farmer's mattock struck a sealed jar in 1945, there are 2 sentences about Mary Magdalene. The first sentence reads, "And the companion of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples, and used to kiss her often on her mouth." The second sentence reads, "There were 3 who always walked with the Lord, Mary, his mother, and her sister, and Magdalene, the one who was called his companion." The word the text uses for companion is a Greek word, koinonos. In the Greek-speaking and Syriac-speaking traditions of early Christianity, koinonos carries a specific weight that the English word companion doesn't fully carry. It describes a bond of mutual participation, of shared life, of standing beside rather than behind. It is not the word you use for a follower. It is not the word you use for a student. It is the word you use for a partner, for someone whose presence is structural, someone without whom the story of the other person is incomplete. Now look at what the canonical Gospels themselves say about this woman. Not the hidden texts, the official, approved, church-sanctioned record. According to Luke, chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, she was among the women who ministered unto Jesus of their substance. She used her own resources to fund the movement. According to Matthew chapter 27, verse 56, she was present at the crucifixion. According to Mark chapter 15, verse 40, she was present at the crucifixion. According to John chapter 19, verse 25, she was present at the crucifixion. When others fled, she stayed. According to Matthew chapter 28, Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, and John chapter 20, she was the first witness of the resurrection in all 4 canonical accounts, not a male disciple, not one of the 12, her. And according to John chapter 20, verses 17 and 18, Jesus gave her a commission. He told her to go and announce the resurrection to the others. He trusted her, and only her, with the most important news in the history of the world. But here is what's fascinating. One of the Church's own early theologians, a man named Hippolytus of Rome, who was active around 170 to 235 CE and wrote a commentary on the Song of Songs, was the first Christian writer in history to give Mary Magdalene a formal title. He called her Apostola Apostolorum, in Latin, the Apostle to the Apostles, the person commissioned to carry the resurrection announcement to the very people who would carry it further. The institution that later spent 14 centuries teaching you that Mary Magdalene was a reformed prostitute had, in its own 3rd century writings, in the work of its own theologian, called her the Apostle to the Apostles. And nobody told you. And then there is the Gospel of Mary. The Gospel of Mary is the only known gospel in the Christian tradition named for a woman. It survives in the Berlin Codex, a Coptic papyrus manuscript purchased in Cairo in 1896, and it portrays Mary Magdalene as the disciple who received visions and teachings the others had not received. It depicts her encouraging the other disciples after the resurrection, steadying them when they are in grief and uncertainty. And it records something the Church spent a very long time ensuring you would not read. A dispute. According to the Gospel of Mary, chapter 17, verses 16 through 22 of the Berlin Codex text, one of the male disciples rises and objects to her authority directly. He says, and these are the exact words preserved in that document, "Did he really speak privately with a woman, and not openly to us? Are we to turn about and all listen to her? Did he prefer her to us?" That objection did not go unanswered. The same text preserves a rebuttal from another disciple in that room, who defends her authority and affirms directly that if the Saviour made her worthy, no one else has the standing to reject her. That rebuttal survived. The objection survived. The dispute is right there in the text, visible and readable, over 1800 years later. But here is what did not survive. Of the 18 pages that made up the Gospel of Mary and the Berlin Codex, only 8 remain. Pages 1 through 6 are gone. Pages 11 through 14 are gone. 10 pages of the only Gospel ever named for a woman, the Gospel that recorded her authority and the dispute it caused, are physically absent. Not faded, not illegible, not lost to water damage or centuries of age. Gone. This is not an accident of time. Tell me in the comments whether you have ever felt that the Mary Magdalene you were given, the weeping penitent, the figure of reformed shame, was not the complete picture. that something was removed from her story before it reached you. True seekers of truth like you already sense this. Your intuition about this woman is not confusion. It is perception. And what you are sensing is correct. Why are 10 of the 18 pages of the only gospel named for a woman physically missing? Why did the objection to her authority survive the centuries, while the pages that preceded it did not? What was on those missing pages that the record could not be allowed to preserve? Now hold all of that alongside what the Syriac manuscript in the British Library told you. The Lost Gospel decoding says Jesus had children. The Gospel of Philip, buried for 16 centuries in the Egyptian desert, calls Mary Magdalene his companion, the person who walked with him, the one whose bond with him the text treats as structural and defining. The canonical Gospels call her the woman he trusted above everyone else, with the most important news in human history. The Church's own 3rd century theologian called her the Apostle to the Apostles, and the only ancient Gospel that recorded her authority in any detail is missing 10 of its 18 pages. It was not an accident that those codices were buried. It was not an accident that those pages are gone. Something was being protected against, and the thing being protected against was the truth of who she was and what she left behind when she left Jerusalem. If Mary Magdalene was the companion of Jesus, if she funded his ministry, if she was the first witness of the resurrection, if Jesus trusted her above all others to carry the news, then she was not a follower. She was a partner, and a partner can have children, and children can have names, and names, if you know where to look, can still be found. The trail leads to France, and to a name that has been spoken there for 500 years. The land at the mouth of the Rhône does not end cleanly. It dissolves. The Camargue is a flat wilderness of reed beds and shallow lagoons, where the distinction between land and water has been a matter of argument for millennia, where salt crystallizes on every surface, and the only things moving with any confidence are the flamingos wading through in their thousands, pink against the white glare of the salt flats. It is not the kind of landscape you would choose for a monument. But truth does not choose its hiding places for beauty. It chooses them for survival. And the Camargue has been keeping something alive for a very long time. The town at the southern tip of the Camargue is called Sainte-Marie de la Mer, the Saints of the Sea. It sits on a narrow strip of sand between the lagoon and the open Mediterranean, and at its center stands a church built like a fortress. Thick walls, high towers, narrow windows that look less like openings for light and more like slots for archers. It is the kind of church designed not just to shelter devotion, but to defend it. A church that expected to be contested. And every year, on the 24th and 25th of May, tens of thousands of people descend on this town for a reason that the Catholic Church has never been able to fully explain and has never been able to stop. They are Romani. They come from every country in Europe, from Spain and Hungary and Romania and Portugal and England and Germany and France. They fill the streets until the town cannot contain them. They crowd into the church and stand in the square and overflow onto the beach. They have been making this journey for more than 500 documented years. And the person they have come to see is not in the officially designated saints whose bones rest in a gilded reliquary above the high altar. She has no papal feast day. She has no verified relics. She has never been officially recognized by Rome. She is in the crypt. Her statue stands in the lowest part of the building, below the floor of the nave, in a chamber of stone that holds the smell of centuries. She is carved from dark wood. Her face is dark. She wears dozens of robes layered one on top of the next, offerings from generations of pilgrims piled until the accumulated cloth becomes its own record. She is called Sara la Kale, Sara the Black, and during the festival every May, her statue is lifted from the crypt on the shoulders of the Romani people, and carried through the streets and down to the shore, where the crowd wades into the Mediterranean and lowers her into the water. The same water, according to the tradition preserved here for 15 centuries, where she first arrived. The tradition says this: after the crucifixion, after the days of fear in Jerusalem, a group was placed in a boat in Judea. The boat had no oars, no sail, no provisions. The people who put them there intended for the sea to finish what the courts had started. But the boat didn't sink. It crossed the Mediterranean, and it grounded in the shallow salt marshes of the Camargue. On board were Mary Salome, mother of the apostles James and John, and Mary Jacobè, said to be the sister of the Virgin Mary. And there was a woman named Sarah, who stepped off the boat first, and whose people have been returning to this place in her name ever since. That is the official story. The version Rome has permitted to stand. Sarah was a servant, an Egyptian attendant, the most common version specifies, a dark-skinned woman of uncertain origin who happened to be traveling with women of significance, and who happened, somehow, to inspire 5 centuries of fierce cross-continental pilgrimage from an entire people. But here is the question that version cannot answer. Why would tens of thousands of people cross a continent every year to venerate a servant? Why would a household attendant generate the kind of devotion that persists for 500 years, regardless of what any institution says or does not say? And why is Sarah's statue in the crypt, in the foundation, in the most protected part of the building, when the officially recognized saints are kept above her? In medieval church architecture, the crypt is not a storage space. It is where you put what you cannot afford to lose. And there is this. In 1448, King René of Anjou opened the walls of that church and announced the discovery of what he claimed were the bones of Mary Salome and Mary Jacobè. The official saints received official relics. Sarah received nothing. No bones, no record, no physical claim in the archive, and the pilgrimage to Sarah did not diminish. It intensified. Tell me in the comments what your instinct says about that. I am genuinely fascinated to know how much true seekers of truth like you already sense about what Sarah really was. Your perspective can light the way for others who are only now beginning to ask these questions, because there is another tradition. Not the one Rome authorized, the oral tradition of the Romani people, documented by scholars of Provençal religious history, does not describe Sarah as a servant. It describes her as a child who came on that boat not because she was attending the Marys, but because she belonged to one of them. Because she was born in Judea and carried out of Judea by her mother, placed on a boat with no oars, brought to the corner of the Mediterranean world where the communities receiving her were positioned outside the reach of Rome's most efficient mechanisms of control. According to Susan Haskins, the British scholar whose 1993 study, Mary Magdalene, Myth and Metaphor, is the most comprehensive academic examination of the Magdalene tradition in Western history. The tradition placing Mary Magdalene in the south of France predates all medieval church constructions by centuries. Haskins documents that texts as early as the 9th century attest to this tradition in Provence, long before the church built its famous shrines at Vézelay and Saint-Baume. Something was already there before the church arrived to build on top of it, something older, something the church inherited and then worked very systematically to reinterpret. And in the oldest layer of what was already there was Sarah. The name is not Egyptian, it is Hebrew, Sarah, the same root as Sarah, the wife of Abraham, the matriarch of the covenant people. A first-century Egyptian servant would not carry a Hebrew name. A Jewish child, born in Judea, carried to the south of France by her mother, would carry exactly this kind of name. The Romani oral tradition does not identify Sarah as the daughter of Mary Salome or Mary Jacobè. It identifies her as the daughter of the woman whose name doesn't appear in Rome's official account of the boat, the woman whose name appears in every suppressed gospel, every forbidden document, every text the Church spent centuries working to eliminate. Her mother was Mary Magdalene, and her father, in the tradition the Romani people have carried unbroken for 5 centuries, in the crypt of a fortress church at the edge of a marsh where the land gives up and the sea begins, was the man whose name has never stopped being spoken. The trail that began in a sealed clay jar in the Egyptian desert, that continued through a document in the British Library, that ran through the Gospel of Philip and the testimony of the Pistis Sophia, ends here, in a crypt, in the lowest part of a church built like a fortress, in a dark-faced woman who has been carried into the sea year after year for 500 years. And what Rome built and burned and destroyed to keep that name from reaching you is the chapter that comes next. On September 14th, 591 AD, Pope Gregory I stood before his congregation in Rome and delivered the sermon that would determine how the Western world understood Mary Magdalene for the next 1400 years. He said this: "She whom Luke calls the sinful woman, whom John calls Mary, we believe to be the Mary from whom 7 devils were ejected." In one sentence, he fused 3 completely different women from 3 completely different Gospels into a single composite figure, the unnamed sinful woman of Luke 7, who washed Jesus' feet with her tears and was known in the city as a sinner. Mary of Bethany, who anointed him at supper in her brother Lazarus' house. And Mary Magdalene, the foremost female disciple, the one who funded the ministry, who stood at the cross while the male disciples ran, who was the first witness of the resurrection in all 4 canonical Gospels, who was commissioned to carry the news to the others. Gregory called this composite woman a prostitute. He offered no textual evidence, no citation, no source, because there was none. The canonical Gospels never call Mary Magdalene a prostitute. They never describe her as a sinner. The 7 demons cast out of her are not identified as demons of sexual immorality anywhere in the text. That was Gregory's decision, his alone, and for 1400 years it held. But here is what you need to understand about that decision. Gregory I was one of the most politically sophisticated men ever to hold the office of Pope. He reorganized the entire administrative structure of the Western Church. He negotiated simultaneously with the Lombards and the Byzantine Emperor. He knew exactly what he was doing when he stood up in that church in Rome on September 14th, 591, and delivered those words. He understood that the most dangerous woman in the Christian tradition was not a woman who simply had too much power. She was a woman whose power could not be explained or contained within the categories the institution had built for women. And the most efficient way to neutralize that danger permanently was not to argue against her role. It was to establish, before the question could be asked at all, that she was not the kind of woman whose relationships, movements, or children were worth taking seriously. Because if Mary Magdalene was a reformed prostitute, then the oral tradition of Provence was the devotion of an entire people built around a servant's illegitimate child. And if she was, as the suppressed Gospels described her, the partner of Jesus, the one he loved more than all the disciples, the one he trusted above all others to carry the living teaching out of Judea, then the child in the crypt in the Camargue was something else entirely. Something that no institution that claimed its authority from that same Jesus could afford to acknowledge. The Eastern Orthodox Church never accepted Gregory's conflation. Not then and not now. The Orthodox tradition had always recognized Mary Magdalene as the Apostle to the Apostles, a title given to her by Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century, 300 years before Gregory's sermon. The East and the West divided on this question, and never fully came back together. The Vatican did not officially separate the 3 women Gregory had fused until 1969. Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's feast day to the same rank as the male apostles on June 10, 2016. That elevation was not a liturgical adjustment. It was a 1700-year admission that Gregory had been wrong, and it came more than 7 centuries after the armies arrived in Provence to make sure that the tradition Gregory had set out to destroy wouldn't be rebuilt. We are living in days when prophecies are being fulfilled before our very eyes. We are living in days when manuscripts buried for 1600 years and oral traditions suppressed for 5 centuries are emerging simultaneously and pointing toward the same conclusion. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. Do not miss a single revelation. Now, because the machinery of suppression that Rome built in Provence was not subtle, the Cathars of Languedoc were not a random sect of heretics who happened to occupy the same territory where the Romani pilgrimage to Sara had been established for centuries. They were a community that had preserved, in their theology and in their oral traditions, a version of early Christian history that was incompatible with what Rome had built its authority upon. They believed that direct transmission of spiritual knowledge, person to person, outside the institutional structure, was precisely what Jesus had taught, and in the oldest layer of the Provençal tradition they carried, the channel through which that teaching had arrived in the south of France, was Mary Magdalene, not a reformed sinner, the bearer of the living transmission, the one who came by sea with a child. On July 22nd, 1209, a papal army surrounded the city of Béziers. The city held between 15,000 and 20,000 people. Many were ordinary Catholics. The papal legate leading the siege was a Cistercian monk named Arnaud Amalric, and when the soldiers asked how to distinguish the heretics from the faithful when the city was taken, his answer was preserved in the chronicle of the monk Caesarius of Heisterbach. Cedit eos, novit enim Dominus, qui sunt eos. Kill them all. God will know his own. The city was burned. The people who fled into the church of Saint-Nazaire were burned inside it. Thousands died before the day ended. The date was July 22nd, the feast day of Mary Magdalene. That was not a coincidence. The Albigensian Crusade, launched by Pope Innocent III in 1209 and concluded by the Treaty of Paris in 1229, dismantled the social structures of Languedoc and absorbed the entire culture into the French crown. The Papal Inquisition was founded the same year. What followed was the systematic destruction of every Cathar community in Provence. It did not stop until the last Cathar stronghold, the mountain fortress of Montségur in the Pyrenees, fell on March 16th, 1244. On that day, 214 Quothar Perfecti were led down from the rock and burned in a meadow at the base of the mountain. Every one of them walked into the fire. Not one recanted. 214 men and women who had spent their lives preserving and transmitting something chose burning over surrender. What tradition was worth 214 lives? The Inquisition's own records note that on the night before the surrender, 4 perfecti were lowered down the sheer face of Montségur by rope in the darkness. They were carrying something the records do not name. The inquisitors noted the escape. They never recovered the cargo. We do not know what those 4 people were carrying. We do not know where they went. What we know is that the tradition they served did not end at Montségur. It went underground. It was carried by the people who had already been living beyond the reach of Europe's institutional control, beyond the margin of the Inquisition's most reliable mechanisms, by a people whose displacement was itself a form of protection. The people who came to Sainte Marie de la Mer every year, regardless of what Rome said, because the name they were carrying was not a doctrine that could be argued against, or a text that could be burned. It was a memory, and memories carried in the mouths of people who refuse to stop speaking them are the one thing that no institution, however powerful, has ever been able to permanently destroy. The Romani kept coming. Year after year, the statue of Sara stayed in the crypt. The procession into the sea continued, and in the archives of Western Christianity, in documents the Church had spent centuries ensuring no one would read in their correct sequence, the evidence for who Sarah was had been preserved as well. You have seen two pieces of it. The document in the British Library, the Gnostic Gospels opened from the Egyptian desert. What comes next is what those pieces reveal when you place them together with the tradition that survived the burning of Béziers and the fire at Montségur. Her name has been waiting for you. Let's bring together everything you have uncovered across this journey. You began with a silence. The New Testament names the brothers of Jesus 4 times. It names his mother. It names his legal father. It tells you Jesus had sisters and cannot be bothered to name them. For the most documented religious figure in Western history, the silence around the women of his family is not an absence. It is a structure. Specific, deliberate, the kind of silence that requires effort to maintain across centuries and across competing traditions and across the testimony of communities that refuse to be entirely absorbed by the institution that was trying to manage the record. And the most structured silence of all, the silence at the center of everything you have uncovered in this video, was the silence around whether Mary Magdalene, the woman who funded his ministry, who stood at the cross while the male disciples ran, who was the first witness of the resurrection in all 4 canonical Gospels, had a child. You discovered that a document preserved in the British Library, old enough and specific enough to know what the question was, and specific enough to know better than to answer it openly, tells you that a daughter existed and was known. The daughter was not lost. The daughter was real enough that the document containing her understood it should decline to name her. 2 sons were named, the daughter was not. But the silence that protects a name is not the same as the silence that erases it. The document knew the name existed. It simply refused to say it where the wrong eyes might read. You learned that the sealed clay jar buried in the Egyptian desert in the 4th century, opened in December 1945 by a farmer who had no idea what he was holding, contained texts that no eyes had read for 1,600 years. Those texts described Mary Magdalene not as a reformed sinner, not as a marginal witness, not as the composite prostitute Pope Gregory had constructed in 591. The Gospel of Philip calls her the companion of the Saviour and says Christ loved her more than all the disciples. The Pistis Sophia gives her 39 of the 46 questions in the post-resurrection dialogue with Jesus, while Jesus addresses her as the one whose heart is more directed to the kingdom of heaven than all her brothers. That is not the language describing a follower. It is the language describing a partner, and a partner can be a mother, and a mother's child can have a name. You discovered that the trail left by those texts leads to the south of France, to a town at the edge of a salt marsh at the mouth of the Rhône, to a church built like a fortress, to a crypt below the nave floor, to a dark-faced woman in layered robes who has been carried into the Mediterranean by tens of thousands of Romani pilgrims every May for more than 500 documented years, without papal authorization, without official relics, without one line in the Roman calendar that acknowledges her name. A woman who is called Sarah Lakali, Sarah the Black. A woman whose name is not Egyptian, but Hebrew. A woman who the oldest stratum of the Provençal tradition does not identify as a servant. Her name is Sarah. You witnessed how that name was targeted. Pope Gregory I stood before his congregation in Rome and delivered the sermon that fused 3 different women from 3 different Gospels into a single composite prostitute, with no textual support and one precise political motive, to establish, before the question could be asked, that Mary Magdalene was not the kind of woman whose relationships and movements and children were worth taking seriously. You saw the same motive drive an army into Provence, where the Cathar communities had preserved the oral tradition that identified Sarah as Mary Magdalene's daughter and not her servant. You understood what it meant that Béziers burned on July 22nd, Mary Magdalene's feast day, and what 214 perfecti refusing to recant at Montségur tells you about what they believed they were protecting. And you understood that none of it worked, because the Romani people were already carrying the name, and they did not stop. Here is what the evidence says when you place all three streams together. The British Library document tells you the daughter was known and real enough to protect by withholding. The Gospel of Philip and the Pistis. Sophia tell you Mary Magdalene was not a follower, but a partner, the one Jesus trusted above all others to carry the living teaching. The oral tradition of the Romani people, 500 years of unbroken pilgrimage to a crypt at the edge of the sea, names the child Sarah and identifies her mother as Mary Magdalene. The name Sarah is Hebrew. The devotion surrounding her has survived the Albigensian Crusade, the Papal Inquisition, the burning of Montségur, and 14 centuries of official institutional silence, 3 independent streams of evidence. One conclusion, according to Susan Haskins, the British scholar whose work, Mary Magdalene, Myth and Metaphor, is the most comprehensive academic study of the Magdalene tradition in Western history. The Provençal tradition connecting Mary Magdalene to the south of France predates all medieval church constructions by centuries. Something was already there, something the church inherited and then spent its political and military resources trying to reinterpret. And what was already there, in the oldest layer of what the church could not erase, was the name of a child who arrived by sea and whose mother was the most important woman in the Christian story. This is not theory. This is convergence, a manuscript, a buried library, a living tradition of 500 years. When 3 independent streams of evidence arrive at the same name without having been designed to arrive there, that convergence is not coincidence. It is testimony. It is not coincidence that you are watching this video now. It is not coincidence that these truths are resonating in you. These documents and these traditions have survived 1,500 years of suppression to arrive at a moment when the means exist to carry them to every person on earth who is ready to receive them. You are part of something that has been building for a very long time. A recovery of what was taken. A restoration of what was withheld. A global awakening that was, by any reasonable reading of the evidence, exactly what the traditions you have encountered in this video predicted would one day come. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell. Do not miss a single revelation. What comes next will follow the trail from Sarah, forward through the centuries, through the documents and the bloodline traditions, and the communities that carried her name across time to reach the present day. And remember this, the most dangerous truth in the Christian story was never the resurrection. The resurrection is a theological claim, and theological claims can be managed, debated, interpreted, and absorbed by institutions that need to control them. What could not be absorbed was a child, because a child is not a theology. A child is a history that leaves traces, a history that leaves names, a history that leaves a dark-faced woman in a crypt at the edge of the sea, carried into the water by her people every May for 500 years, not because Rome told them to, not because any institution authorized them, but because the memory of who she was had been placed in their keeping, and they had decided, generation after generation, that they would not be the ones to let it go. Her name was Sarah. They always knew. Now,